So when I was in the seminary the first time, because I had two different times that I studied, having left for a few years to go off and do other things, teaching Spanish primarily and religion, I had the opportunity to go with the St. James Society to Lima, Peru. We stayed in Barranco. We visited various places in Peru. And we visited the church of the Dominicans in Lima, in the capital city. And it was one of the first times that I saw the remains of a saint, Rose of Lima. Her head is preserved. It is intact. And that was, I think, a sign of God's love for her and a love for his church that he left behind, intact, something which was beautiful to the world, and yet something that she didn't desire, because she desired love above all things. She desired to give her entire life for the Lord and for his church in prayer, interceding for the church, as she continues to do even now. Rose was known as Isabel, which is also a beautiful name. God remembers. And so God remembered her for her love for him and his love for her. Today, the Gospels, and even the first reading, speaks of love. Naomi left her land and went to the Moabite region. And there her sons married Moabite women. One of them, as Naomi was going back, went back to her people. And Naomi even encouraged Ruth to do the same. And yet Ruth desired to stay with her because of her love for Naomi, her mother-in-law, and of her love for Naomi's God, whom she had gotten to know certainly through Naomi and through the prayers that she had learned probably through that family. The second reading, the Gospel, tells us of the greatest commandments. The Sadducees, in order to trick Jesus, one of the doctors of the law, asked Jesus, which is the greatest commandment? Trying to trick him, obviously. And yet Jesus goes back to the prophets and the law, two most important things for the Jewish people, even still, the law and the prophets and what they teach. And he gives us these two great commandments. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul. And the second is like it. You shall love others as you love yourself. We know that in another part, Jesus would say, love others as I have loved you, because of his sacrifice for us on the cross. And yet in this part, he says, love your neighbor as yourself. How many people always love themselves? It's not the easiest thing to do, I don't think, especially when you look in the mirror in the morning. But even then, not having anything to do with how you look. There are some times that you know you're not being as good as you can. And certainly, I hope that makes you think twice about love. Because as St. Augustine teaches us, love God and do whatever you wish, or what you wish. Meaning that if you love God, your desire will always to be to do good out of love for him. Simone Weil was a French philosopher. She was a political activist, but she became a mystic. And in her book on Gravity and Grace, she says, God's love for us is not the reason that we should love God. God's love for us is the reason for loving ourselves. Otherwise, how could we love ourselves? God loves us. He loved us before we were created, before we came into being. God's love for us never ends. And so it's only in that way that we could possibly love ourselves, because of his divine love. It's also a call to us always to love the Lord, to put God first before all things. When Jesus says love your neighbor as yourself, certainly he doesn't mean in a narcissistic manner, as Narcissus would look at himself in the water in a reflection and fall in love with himself. That's not what Jesus means. But to love yourself even in your imperfections, because in that way we can look at a brother or sister and love them even in their imperfections. We know that we're called to love even or especially those we don't feel too great about. That's the challenge, isn't it? And so if we learn to love ourselves with our imperfections because of God's infinite love, his divine love, then hopefully we can look at someone and even without knowing them, love them, because we know they're created by God, we know they're a child of God, and we know that they're our sister or our brother. And so we look to Rose of Lima to intercede for us, to be messengers of love. We look to those who have taught us about love, our parents. My mother, for me, is the greatest example of love, because even when I offended her, I know that she never stopped loving me. And so if she could love in that way, certainly God, who is infinite good, can love us infinitely. And so we turn to him to learn, to sit in his heart, and to learn the lesson of love, and to share that love among ourselves, with our brothers and sisters, and certainly with God.